Hello, I'm Ed Rabyd, otherwise known as the Rabyd Atheist, a former pastor turned atheist, now a compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. Feel free to like or dislike the video as you see fit, so feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below, and I would appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. You're also free to share my videos as much as you like. The purpose of this channel is educational in regards to atheist and deconversion issues, as well as any other issue that relates to those issues, such as Bible, theology, politics, philosophy, etc. I also want to give a shout out to the Rabyd Nation. Thank you very much for your support and continued support, and all of those who want to be part of the Rabyd Nation. Today is our second lesson in the Rabyd Atheist Teaches Sunday School, and we're going to talk about Genesis 1 and 2. And before we get to that, we need to understand that this is a Sunday school class. I'm using my expertise to just kind of go over the general issues that I have as an atheist with the text and why the text is problematic to me and why different issues exist. As I've said before, this may not completely touch all the Bible, but I'm going to hit every part that is significant as far as theology and understanding of quote-unquote God. Today, though, with Genesis 1 and 2, we get a typical creation story. Now, my first lesson, I talked a lot about the JEDP theory or the JEPD theory, depending on which one was presented to you. But the basic issue in Genesis 1 and 2 is that you have the J and E sources going back and forth with two different creation stories. If I were to do this really properly, I would actually probably do Genesis 1 through 2/3, okay, because that's the whole story, the 7 days of creation. And then it picks up with another close-up story of the creation of Adam and Eve. And I do want to talk about all of this because it's interesting to say that. Now, in order to save a little time, rather than read the entire text, which would take a great deal of time, and I don't want to do that, I'm going to ask you to pause the video right here, go find your favorite version of the Bible, and read Genesis 1 and 2. And then when you come back, restart up the video, and hopefully we'll be ready to begin. All right, have you done that? You've paused the video, you went back and you read. If you haven't done, do it now. All right, so now that you've read the story, let's talk about it. The problem I have with Genesis 1, and most people have with Genesis 1, is it doesn't make a lot of sense given our modern understanding of cosmology. Because cosmology is that of how you look at the universe, how you look at and understand the way the world really is, the way the universe is, the solar system and things like that. The idea of the Earth going around the sun and the sun being a star among many and so on and so forth is modern cosmology. The cosmology of the Bible starts right off with something that's very, very different. If you really want to really understand what the narrator of this story is talking about, what you really need to do is start envisioning basically a flat table that's probably circular with, legs downward and then a dome over it. And the whole thing is surrounded by water. So when the narrator says something to the effect of the waters above and the waters below, like he does in verse 6, let us separate between the waters. Let's just separate water from water. And God made the vault and separated the water from under the vault with the water above it. And it was so. And he called the vault sky, and there was evening and there was morning a second day. When you're asking what's being described here is God is basically creating the pocket of air from the waters above and the waters below. And then he creates this vault or this firmament, or depending on which way you describe it. But basically, when you read other passages of scriptures later, what you get is a description of a dome, a glass dome, if you will, over this table that basically keeps the water above out and the water below underneath it. Also, sometimes the water below is called the Great Deep. And so once you understand that this is the universe that is being created here, Genesis 1 makes a lot more sense, because in the sense that you're understanding it as the narrator would have understood it. Basically, the story of the creation of Genesis 1 through about 2-3 is this. That God came along, saw a formless space, sort of, that was all water. And, it's not ex nihilo, because it says the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters, plural. So you have all these waters hovering around and slowly mingling and congesting together, and God comes along and decides to put some order to it. So he creates light. Now, this creates a lot of problems with the story, but to a cosmology back in the day that's going with this flat earth kind of dome over it cosmology, it makes perfect sense. The God basically turns on a light so he can see what he's doing. We're talking about darkness. We're talking about everything. So God comes along and gets rid of the darkness. He then, of course, as I talked about already, separates, creates a firmament, basically. It's not that he creates the waters. He just pushes them aside, puts a firmament, a dome in there, and then basically calls that dome and what's inside that dome sky. It's clear, it's air, it's the breath of life. You will see in Scripture a lot where the spirit or breath is equated with each other. To them, to these people back then, what you had was basically this idea that you were alive because God breathed in you the breath of life. So this is not unusual. We'll actually get to that today. Then you have in the next day, let the water be under the sky be gathered into one place, let dry ground appear. And God called the dry land land, and the waters he called seas, and God saw that it was good. He also creates vegetation on this day. Now, at this point, with our modern cosmology, we can always ask the question, how in the world did all these vegetations, trees, everything survive without the light of the sun? We know now that photosynthesis is a real thing, but back then they didn't. To them, this whole idea of vegetation was a supernatural thing. They didn't understand it, so they labeled it as supernatural. It's a post hoc rationalization about how vegetation works. It's a bad one, and it doesn't line up with reality, but it's understandable given what they knew. They basically said, hey, God created all these land and things to grow. The fact that we are related to plants somehow seemed to escape them. And so, yeah, this is kind of a weird thing at this point, because now we have this dome, we have these land in places, we have seas in places, we have basically the earth as it is on a flat disk with a firmament over top of it. Now, later on, you'll hear the term windows of heaven. This is how the ancients believe rain happened, that in this firmament, in this vault, you have these open air things, these windows basically that can be opened to allow rain through, allow some of the water that's outside of it, the dome, in. Seems kind of dangerous to me. You might end up flooding the earth depending on the water pressure, but that's the way they conceived it. And it's a nice, fanciful, childlike way to understand the way the universe is. Of course, they created, God creates the sun and the moon to rule each of these things. He creates stars so that you can have for signs and seasons and everything, mark the sacred times of the year. I hate to break the news to all you theists out there, but this becomes the basis of, how shall we say, astrology being a real thing for some time. The funny thing about the Bible is it never condemns astrology. It never condemns looking at the heavens looking for a sign. And so whenever I hear talking about astrologers, I'm like, you do realize that God said that right at the beginning, that these would be signs to mark sacred times, days, and years, right there in verse 14. You have two great lights, we have the moon, we have the sun, and he puts them inside the vault of the earth. Now, you need to understand, all these lights are flipping around inside this vault. Now, this vault now starts to become a very big place, but that's the way that they conceived it. They were looking up and seeing a curvature, but understanding it in terms of flatness. That's why they have a dome. Okay, then on the fifth day, what happens? God creates all these things that live in the water. He also creates all the birds. Every creeping thing after its kind. Of course, whenever I talk to creationists and ask them to define the word kind, they never can do it. When some of them do try, they end up at certain points, but the moment they do end up on those points, they end up, as many other people have observed, in a phylogeny that doesn't work. And so, yeah, it's just one of those things where it's funny to hear them talk about it because they just don't have it. The problem, of course, with this is evolution has indeed proven a lot of things. And one of the things that it has been proven is birds are not creations, and neither are any of the creatures of the sea. This is a wonderful example of why we have so much variety, because the environments that each creature finds himself is very different, and the selection pressures make them different. This is a cosmology of creation, and the moment we have God creating some form of life is the moment we have something that we know is patently untrue. Then on the sixth day, of course, God creates all the livestock, all the wild animals, everything after its kind in the same way. And then he makes man. Now, the account of the creation of man in Genesis 1 is very much a, how shall I say it, a summary. God waxes poetic. God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, created them. And God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and every living creature that moves on the ground. And I give you every seed-bearing plant for food, all the beasts of the ground that move along the ground, everything that has I give it every green plant for food." And it was so. And so God saw that he made, and it was very good, and there was evening and morning the sixth day. And thus the heavens and earth were completed in their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. And then God blessed the seventh day and holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating he had done. And then verse 4 is kind of controversial, because it can, but most of the scholars put it in the original source that has been talking about it. Yes, the JEPD theory is at work here. Genesis 1 up until verse 4 is definitely the source. It's Elohim. The word for God is Elohim every single time. And so it's an account written by the Elohimist source. And so it's an overarching view. It's less anthropomorphic. God is very much more standoffish, a creator, a powerful creator. And this is not to be, to diminish the work. It's a good work of poetry, and it's an interesting look into how ancient peoples understand the cosmology of the world. But let's be honest, this cosmology doesn't work today. If you went out and proposed today that the Earth was actually a flat disk with a dome over top of it, hooked to foundations that are hooked to wood, and that everything around it was water, you would be laughed out. There's just no way that this is true. Now, here's the thing. Here's my thing about Christians and their fundamentalist ways. If you're going to be a fundamentalist Christian, then here's what you have to do. You also have to become a flat earther with a belief in all of the things that I just said, because that is what the Bible says. Now, I've always heard the excuse, well, God, reveals himself in the culture of his day, and, that's their understanding. We know it's a bad understanding today, but, you're hemming and hawing here. If you're going to believe the Bible for everything it says, then you need to be a flat earther. I'm sorry, you do. At least I'm going to say this about the flat earthers who are Christians. They're at least being honest. They're being honest about the way the Bible portrays the world, and they're not being dishonest about it. And this, of course, is problematic to me, because to me, truth is that which conforms to reality. That's the first part of the definition of truth to me. The rest of it is, and that is adjudicated by predictive power. So I have this view of cosmology that has flat Earth disk with a dome, and then I have another view of cosmology that has a sphere moving around the sun and being a part of a universe that has evolutionary theory, other theories working into it, gravity, and so on and so forth, these scientific solid theories. And I can look at that and say, well, that conforms to reality. I look at this dome thing, and that does not conform to reality. So why should I accept it? Now, here's the real problem for those of you that want to tell me to trust the Bible. The Bible comes out of the gate already wrong. It is completely wrong about the nature of the universe. It's completely wrong about how we're here or why we're here. It makes us a special creation of God, which is a great way to pat our ego. But that doesn't change the fact that there's no evidence for that and there's no truth to it. One of the great problems that, of course, I've had with these whole things about all the stuff that deals with creation is that when I went to creationists to try to get answers to the objections that non-creationists had, the creationists simply gave me the same tired old tropes. I don't think creationists have revised their viewpoints on much of anything for a long time. The funny thing is that they had to abandon the cosmology here. I often get the funny interpretations from theists because, oh, well, that's poetic or that's figurative and this is literal. And it's like, well, how do you know which one's figurative and literal? I actually asked this question of a professor in seminary. His response to me, well, that's up to the interpreter. Really? You mean I can make it up? If I want part of the passage to be literal, I just choose to make it literal? Do you realize how dishonest that is? Do you realize how you're just making stuff up at that point? It's imaginary characters talking about an imaginary world at this point. And this has been my problem with Genesis 1 ever since I became an atheist, is that it doesn't represent reality at all. None of it. There is no God that created anything. We know so much about how we got here, where we came from. Do we have gaps in our knowledge? Absolutely. But that doesn't give you license to just throw your God into those gaps. You know, you have to prove that your point is true. In order to prove the creation of the universe by a God, any God, pick one, you would have to first of all prove A, that God exists, and B, that he wanted to be creative. You don't know that. There are many myths and mythologies that don't have creation of man or the universe so much as a special thing like this passage does, but rather the creation of the universe is more an accidental thing. Now, once we get to verse 2:4, which is the last part of the we switch to the Yahwehist source. The creation of Adam and Eve is basically a Yahwehist source, and the Yahwehist source tends to get a little bit anthropomorphical. It tends to tell a very narrative-driven story, and that's what the story of the creation of Adam and Eve is, and it really just sets up what follows. Adam and Eve become the prototype human beings. Now, from a genetic standpoint, this is already pretty weird. You have a genetic bottleneck that just wouldn't work. The thing that most people don't understand about evolution is that it wasn't just suddenly two Homo sapiens, one male and one female, that developed. That this was a slow development where something transformed over a long period of time from one thing to another. Homo sapiens have only been around actually as a group of people, and they started out as a group of people probably 100,000 to 250,000 years ago. It's really kind of hard to tell. But the fact of the matter is there weren't just two people. There was a whole population of people. And in fact, geneticist says we got lucky because for a while there, because of an extinction event, we were probably only one of 12,000 Homo sapiens left on planet Earth. Not completely deadly to make a genetic bottleneck, although it is enough of a bottleneck that we know it's there. But you know, I'm no expert, but it seems to me that we don't have an Adam and Eve story in reality. What we have is a group of populations that's transforming from one species to another, and Homo sapiens are the result. And we turned out to be pretty clever for ourselves, didn't we? But now we have this story here in Genesis chapter 2, finishing up Genesis chapter 2 after God takes a break. An interesting concept, an omnipotent God taking a break. But it will be used as the justification later in the text for a lot of things like the Sabbath day rules and so on and so forth. But at this point, we have a different kind of account. And what's most damning about this account is actually the first part of chapter 5. It says, no shrub had yet appeared on earth, and no plant had yet sprung up. For the Lord God did not send rain on the earth, and there was no one to work the ground. But streams came up from the earth and watered the whole surface of the ground. Then the Lord God formed man out of the dust and ground and breathed it into the nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. What's problematic about this? I thought on day 3 we had all the shrubs had appeared on earth, and all the plants were created, and then man is created 3 days later. But here we have the text openly saying that no shrub had yet appeared upon earth. It didn't exist. This account of creation completely contradicts the first one. This is why you know that there's actually 2 accounts here. Now, you can kind of justify the timeline as this being more detailed account of day 6, but that can't be true given verse 5. Once you get to verse 5, you suddenly realize that these are 2 different accounts of creation. And the editors are trying to preserve both traditions of the creation of mankind, but at the same time, they're also trying to mesh them together. Either the Yahweh source didn't really disagree with the Elohim source, or the two accounts were very different of how man got here, or the Yahweh source didn't bother with the creation of the cosmos. They just assumed the cosmos existed. So what you have here is a story of suddenly saying, oh, that's that third day of creation, that didn't happen. We're going to create our own days of creation here. There's not really any days in this story, so much as we needed God needed somebody to till the ground, needed somebody to take care of the plants and so forth and so on. And so God makes a man to do that, to perform a certain task. This seems very strange, and it seems to be written by a farmer. The farming being the oldest profession, right before the second oldest profession on the planet. But it's not to say that anything else is going wrong here per se. It's just the text makes it clear in verse 5, there's no plants. There's no plants because God hasn't created mankind yet. Whereas in the first account, you have plants being completely created on day 3 and man being created on day 6. It's a blatant contradiction, and one of the biggest ones in the early accounts of the Bible. At this point, if you were a rational thinking person and you were reading the Bible objectively, you'd set it aside and say, you know what, at this point, I now know that this is mythology. But if you've been trained to overlook all these factors, then you just keep moving and don't really pay much attention. And so God makes a man, plants a garden, and puts man into that thing. And he puts 2 trees in it. He puts one, the tree of life, and the other tree, the knowledge of good and evil, plus a whole bunch of other trees. And then he places man in the garden. At this point, I got to comment on God's, how shall we say, indiscretion here. The thing with God at this point is he creates a being that knows nothing, understands nothing, and then literally puts him in the tree with a bunch of trees that will give him food, the tree of life that will allow him to live forever, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which tells us a lot of things, doesn't it? Like God, in taking care of his infant children, will leave bleach on the floor and glasses. And that's exactly kind of the way it is. And then just hopes that they won't drink it. It seems to me God could have been a better parent. It seems like a better parent would explain things to his children a lot better than what he will. And, we get the description of this garden. We get the description of all these rivers. And so to these people, the Garden of Eden was a real place that really existed, that was surrounded by 4 rivers. And I think that's very interesting to think, because to the Yahweh source material, the Garden of Eden was a real place that you could have gone to. It's not this fictitious land. And so it would still have evidence of being there. Now, a lot of creationists try to get around this, saying, well, the Garden of Eden was destroyed in the flood of Noah. But it seems strange that the Garden of Eden, guarded by its angel cherub, and specifically detailed in verses 10 through 4, what rivers run around it, you would be able to find it. And why is there no mention of it later in the later passage? It literally disappears after the sword-wielding angel is placed in front of it. It goes away. These were real rivers, real places. And even the commoner man says, hey, the gold in that place is really, really good. This really sounds like somebody spinning a yarn at this point. And the unfortunate part of it is too many people have taken this yarn seriously. Now, we have man, we have him in the garden, and God puts him in the garden to take care of it. And he gives the command. Now, I want to make a note about at the timing of God giving this command. Eve hasn't been created yet. It's something I used to struggle with as a theist, because when you look at the rest of the story and the fall of man, which we'll get to next week, you have to go back to this spot where it says that God places man in the garden and commands him not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For the day you do there, you will surely die. Now, Eve gets this information, but she's not there when God originally commands it. It's only given to Adam. You are free to eat from any tree of the garden, but you must not eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. For the day you eat from it, you will surely die. Now, I want you to make note of that last statement, because we're going to talk about next week who really lied. Did the serpent lie or did God lie? Did Yahweh lie? Okay. Now, we could sit there and say God is being an overprotective parent, but he doesn't need to be. Just take the goddamn tree of good and evil out of there and don't let them touch it until they're ready to make that moral choice. But God doesn't do that. He takes an innocent creation who might be very intelligent and might have a lot of knowledge to do certain things. But as far as moral sense, did he have it? It's hard to say. All of a sudden, God realizes something. Oh man, it's not really good for him to be alone. I'll make a helper suitable for him. And so God creates all the animals, which, you can line up with the sixth day of creation, except given the amount of animals that there are in existence in the world that these people believed in, it would have taken a lot longer than a day to name them all. And, we're literally talking about all these animals. And yet, Adam doesn't find a helper suitable to him. So the whole reason the animals are created was to be paraded by Adam to find a good helper for him. So apparently God has to make a lot of prototypes and doesn't seem to know which helper will be suitable to the man that he's created. The man ends up naming them all, but he doesn't really find anything that's suitable. So God causes him to fall asleep. He takes a rib out of him. He makes a woman out of the rib, and he brings her to the man. And then we have man writing the first love poem. This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, and she shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. This is the why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they will become one flesh. And Adam and his wife were naked, and they felt no shame. Now, at this point, we need to understand something, that there is just no way, from a real rationalist point of view, that this last part of the story even took place. We're dealing with mythology here, because we know for a fact that this is not the way human beings came into existence. It was a long end to a long process that lasted for millions of years. When people want to argue with me evolution or creation, I remind them that evolution is a theory. It kind of takes them back because they're always using the colloquial definition of theory. But anybody who knows anything about a scientific theory knows that it is the highest level of a body of knowledge that indicates a certain thing is true, okay? And that's what a theory. There's other theories too, germ theory and theory of gravity. Nobody questions these anymore, but we'll still continue to question the theory of evolution because they don't want to believe it in relationship to this story. As I look at this story now, though, what the writers are trying to create is an edited copy of a single work where they're trying to take these two different sources, probably one from Israel and the other from Judah, and they're trying to mesh them together into a single narrative. They don't really seem to notice that the two narratives have a few things that contradict each other. Most notably, that God doesn't really seem to tell man to rule the earth and subdue it in the second account, where he creates Adam and Eve. And, somehow plants weren't created on the third day because God has to recreate them again. He has to wait to create man before he creates the plants. So there's two open, blatant contradictions and probably many more that I'm missing. But the fact of the matter is the cosmology of these people doesn't line up with reality. It doesn't line up with what we know. And so it's mythology like any other mythology. So the question becomes, why do we still accept this mythology? Well, I think a large part of it is this type of theologian, the monotheist, has figured out ways to adapt monotheism to the world as much as possible. Even in the case of creation versus evolution, there are many Christians, many theists that believe in evolution and even practice it, and many of them are scientists in it. They don't deny the reality. What they try to do is say, well, these stories were the first attempt to understand God. But at that point, you've already taken the Bible and put it in the category of suggested reading rather than authoritative conduct. Because now you can't read it for science. No scientist that's self-respecting would read the Bible anymore and assume that it's going to tell them what is true about the world. I know there are creationist organizations such as, Answers in Genesis and a few others that I used to follow when I was a much younger Christian. But I began to realize that they were problematic because they were starting with an assumption that the Bible story was true. If the Bible story is true, you shouldn't have to start with that assumption. You should just be able to approach the universe and find this cosmology. So, what do we learn today? Well, I think we've learned a couple of things that we can apply to life. Uh, Number one, that if you want to be honest and true to the biblical text, you should be a flat earther believing in a dome surrounded by water where God created land in the middle with vegetation. But that story contradicts the second story from the Yahweh source, which talks about plants not even being on the earth because no man had been created to till them. The language is universal too. It's all plants, both cases. It's not, well, some plants hadn't been created until Adam and Eve got it wrong. It still contradicts the story. The two stories are very different in their narrative about the purpose of mankind too. The first story says, fill the earth, subdue it, go after it, take control, take charge of it. The other story doesn't do that. What it does is it kind of goes around and around in circles about how, man is just created for the purpose of tilling the ground. He's not to rule over anything, really. He names the animals, but he doesn't really control them. The only helper he finds suitable for him has to be made out of a rib for him. And we have Adam and Eve, naked and not ashamed, in the Garden of Eden, living together happily, and so on and so forth. This idea, though, of creation will influence the relationship between man and woman long before the fall of man happens. A lot of people think that theology of the differences between men and women and why men rule over women starts with the fall, but it doesn't. It actually starts with both creation stories. While the one story doesn't really make a differentiation between the sexes, the second one does. The one says that Adam is in charge and Eve is just a helper. This is something that Paul will pick up in 1 Timothy chapter 2, where he says that the reason that women shouldn't be in leadership in the church is because Adam was created first. This has nothing to do with the fall at this point. It just simply says Adam was created first, then Eve. Therefore, Adam should be in charge of Eve. Long before we get to the fall and poor Mama Eve being demonized for wanting knowledge, we get to the idea that of creative order is also what tells us who's in charge. And so this is stuff that is used today. There's a dangerous theology here, and I want to point it out. So, that's all for today. I think we'll stop here. I've already waxed poetic for over a half hour about this stuff. And, we'll let you know that this is kind of the setup for next week when we talk about the fall of man and some of the consequences thereof, how the world seems to kind of unravel and go apart. But, you have a lot of things going on and a lot of things happening. But I also want to leave you with thanks for continuing to support the channel. I appreciate every bit of it. Also, a little bit of announcement. I'm having a lot of things happen in my life. I'm going to try to keep the Sunday school up and going each week, but I'm also moving very shortly. And so, you might want to say goodbye to the background because I don't think I'll be able to duplicate it wherever I end up going. And you might see me in a number of different odd places for a while until I settle down into my own place. I'll have more details about what's going on in my life, but to suffice it to say that I'm moving from where I am to somewhere else, probably within the next couple of weeks. So, you'll still see this background for a couple more videos probably, but at some point it's going to disappear or change because I'm packing or whatever. And I didn't want anybody to be alarmed about that, but I'll talk more about that later. Once again, thank you for stopping by. I appreciate you coming by and listening to an old preacher who's no longer a preacher talk about the Bible and why he has so many problems with it now. I want to thank everybody who's come by and who's subscribed, liked, and all the rest of this stuff. And, just give a shout out to the Rabyd Nation. Thank you very much for supporting me and supporting me on Patreon and everything else. You're also free to follow me on Facebook. If you're looking for announcements sometimes about the channel, that's where you can find them, and a few other things. You'll also be informed whenever a video drops there as well. And, hopefully I can convince you to be a rabid atheist like myself. In the meantime, this is Ed Rabyd, also known as the Rabyd Atheist, signing off and wishing you a good day.